Hello, listeners. Welcome to the U.S. Department of State's Global Innovation through Science and Technology, or GIST, Innovation Talk on the Lean Startup Methodology. My name is Christina Tamer. I'm a Senior Program Officer at VentureWell. VentureWell is the primary implementing partner for the GIST initiative, and I will be your host for today. I am joined by the wonderful Grant Warner for this GIST Innovation Talk. Grant is the Director of Innovation and Entrepreneurship at Howard University. Grant, it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you, Christina. Great to be here.
Thank you. Let's start out with hearing a little bit about your background and your work.
Sure. Well, I think once someone introduces you as wonderful, there's nowhere to go but down from there. But as you mentioned, I'm the Director of Innovation at Howard University. I'm also a member of the faculty. And in fact, I got started in innovation because when I joined the faculty, not at Howard, but at another institution, I actually launched a startup at the same time. So we developed a software solution that we sell to instructional technologists that drive engagement and retention. And in the process of developing that, so going from idea to first round of funding, I learned more than I had in my whole PhD. So I thought it was something that would be great to share with students in particular, and started to do the work on campus. So from there, I became aware of NSF's I-Corps program, got involved with that, and the rest is history. So I've been an instructor in both the NSF and NIH I-Corps programs, which rely heavily on Lean Startup for the last, several years.
That's really awesome. The lived experience as an entrepreneur, I'm sure, brings a ton of credibility in addition to the PhD, of course, but your students definitely are really lucky to have that lived experience as an entrepreneur, as well as in the NSF and NIH I-Corps programs. So those programs, as I'm sure in your own as well, lean heavily on the Lean Startup methodology. Could you explain a little bit about what the Lean Startup methodology is for us?
Sure. So I'll paraphrase from Steve Blank. In my view, kind of three big ideas that, undergird this Lean Startup approach. So one is that startups are not small companies. And this is, a really distinguishing characteristic, right? So startups are searching for a business model, and companies are executing a business model. So, when you think about everything related to your startup in that context, that means everything is a guess, right? So you have to search for validation or invalidation, both are fine, but you have to search. So that ties into the second big idea, right? Which is, well, if I'm actually searching for validation or invalidation, where do I need to go, right? And it's, well, you have to get out the building, right? Don't just talk to your co-founders or your colleagues. You have to get out and talk to customers early, right? They have all of the answers. You and your group don't have many of them, right? So this early engagement with customers is really the hallmark of Lean Startup. Then the third big idea is kind of also related to that, right? So I have guesses, I have to engage customers. The question is, how do I engage them, right? And part of it is with the scientific method, right? This blending of scientific method and entrepreneurship. So the founder is venturing into the unknown. The scientific method is all about exploring the unknown. So what you want to do is get into these build, measure, learn, iterative loops, which allow you to explore some of these fundamental hypotheses, right? Starting with problem solution fit, right? Do my customers have the problem that I think they have, right? Where does this problem fit in their priorities, et cetera? And extending all the way out to business model fit, right? Where it's, I understand the customer, the problem, how to get the solution to them, how would I market to them, how do I price this, right? All of these things are guesses when you start, and you move through the process sequentially to begin to validate them.
Really nice overview. I think Steve Blank would be proud. The three tenets, just to recap what I heard, are really, startups are very different than companies, right? You're searching for a business model before you start executing the business model. You need to get out of the building to really understand what your customers need, right? You could spend hours making something, but if nobody cares about it, it doesn't matter. You don't have a business. And then everything is a guess or a hypothesis until it's actually proven true. So to that end, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about the hypothesis testing and maybe an experience that you've gone through in, a hypothesis that you had, and then whether or not it was wrong or right, and how you validated it, or someone else you saw.
Yeah. So recently I was helping to run a program in Canada, also sponsored by VentureWell. So,
Small
so
world.
in there were a number of entrepreneurs who, kind of did a good job in the customer discovery process. Again, kind of going from hypothesis to something that was validated. So one in particular was working on a next generation water-based paint. So they thought the big need was really this improved performance. The improved performance boiled down to being greener, right? So it's driven by this environmental health and safety concerns, and that's not uncommon. We find, students in particular who are, trying to make things greener. So very early on in the process, they thought that this had, kind of business to consumer applications, went out to a Home Depot, started talking to people about how they buy paints, and realized very quickly that, well, their top areas of concern was, well, how many colors were there and what's the price? And this issue of environmental health and safety really did not come up. And so that entrepreneur, thankfully, took the prodding, listened to the customer, and began to explore commercial markets. So went to trade shows virtually. It was still during the pandemic. Looked at trade shows and found that there was an ecosystem, of industrial users where they did have a need that was driven by regulation and driven by a need to reduce the process steps that are required by current solvent-based solutions. So when the program ended, he had moved from, your average everyday consumer, a handyman type purchaser, to this industrial market where there are project managers, right, in the light industrial sector, who are looking for solutions with lower levels of corrosivity, and had targeted a particular range, C1 to C3, that he felt he would be able to impact. So really kind of a dramatic shift in focus, being open to the idea that his initial guess was wrong, both about the customer and about the need.
That's a really great example of the nuance that only comes out through actually talking to customers. I think they did the right thing by starting, talking to customers in Home Depot, but that then led them to the markets that actually care about the benefits that their product was offering. And I think it's a really good example as well of listening to your customers to make sure that the time you spend on developing a technology or a product is actually what they want. They could have spent so much time building out the product for a regular Home Depot customer when all they cared about was the color selection. So sounds like it saved them a lot of time.
Yeah. So they were happy at the end.
That's great. One thing that you mentioned was the customer discovery, and I want to dig into that a little bit. Maybe now, how you do it now these days in the pandemic, and also how you do it in the before times and in a traditional environment. So, what are the best practices for customer discovery?
Yeah, really good question. As you noted, it's been a big shift in customer discovery practice because of the pandemic. We used to be very big on face-to-face, very big on showing up in office parks and regions where there was a lot of commercial development that applied to your innovation, making sure you showed up in person in trade shows. All of those things are no longer available. And what we focus on now is a combination of LinkedIn and Zoom that have worked pretty effectively. So one thing I would say is making sure, if you're doing discovery, that you have an up-to-date social media account. As I mentioned, in the US, LinkedIn is a really strong professional social network. So it doesn't have that presence everywhere, but you can use whatever social network you have available to yourself to do relevant searching. But that's the first key. You gotta figure out how to identify people. The other thing that we've noticed is that the trade shows are coming back virtually, but they're coming back and they use technologies other than Zoom or common video conferencing so that you can have an experience like going to a trade show. I can walk up and talk to somebody virtually, right? I can insert myself into groups of people talking, and it provides an opportunity again to do some of this frontline discovery, talk to people about their needs, etc. So we encourage that. And of course, the biggest aha moment, as it were, is how effective Zoom is for doing these types of interviews. You know, by and large, in the programs for NSF and NIH, there has not been a loss in learning because people are not going and doing interviews in person. I think they're getting deep insights via Zoom. And in fact, it has lowered some barriers, right? Because we don't have to travel. Someone doesn't have to set aside a great deal of time in order to engage with you. So, you know, again, so that would be my summary of some of the best practices we use. Go on social media, make sure that that's updated. Think about, you know, how you outreach to someone to connect with them, you know, get them interested in a short conversation. Try to do it via Zoom and continue to try to leverage where customers aggregate, right? So these trade shows are coming back online, conferences back online. So try to leverage those.
Yeah, one thing that is sort of underpinning everything that you're saying is that people buy products, not buildings or institutions. So, you know, even though we can't necessarily get together in person right now, there's still an opportunity to reach out to people via LinkedIn or through these trade shows. One of our entrepreneurs has been attending all of the virtual trade shows in their industry and has been researching on LinkedIn all of the attendees because they can see their names and then reaching out to them on LinkedIn that way. So I thought that was a really smart way of doing that.
Totally agree. Totally agree. We had had office hours actually yesterday with a team. I'm in a cohort right now, and this came up like, well, should I reach out on LinkedIn or email? And I would say, and you do both.
Yeah.
The value in LinkedIn, as you said, is that I can get a real good understanding of that person's background, and vice versa. So that's why you have to be really cognizant of how you present yourself in your profile.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I hear a lot from startups that they hit dead ends sometimes on who to talk to. So if that happens to a team that's working with you in your program, what do you usually say to them if they're hitting a dead end?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, you know, one, the best practice is always after you've spoken to someone is ask them for referrals. So now that they're aware of what you're interested in and they have a particular expertise and a network, perhaps they'll share that network with you. And if you find the right person, you might hit, you know, a gold mine in that way. So I personally did some discovery over the summer and found one connector who provided somewhere like 20 different contacts for interviews. So you just never know. So you should always ask for that. But the other thing that you want to do is really make sure that you have done some kind of ecosystem mapping, right? So who are the important players in your particular industry? You'd be surprised by how many different people you could have meaningful conversations with. And oftentimes that's overlooked because we might just be focusing on one type of customer or one customer type, right? Maybe it's just the end user, but you have this whole network of influencers, decision makers, et cetera. And you want to make sure that you're talking to them up and down the supply chain as it might be relevant to your innovation.
Yeah, it's not necessarily just one end user or one payer that you need to talk to. You need to talk to everyone along the value chain. So I think that's a really important point. To that end, do you have any advice for how to know when you've done enough interviewing? When is enough enough?
It's never enough. So, you know, one of the things we like to say is that for good companies, this becomes part of your DNA. So you should always, you know, make sure that you're engaging with your customers because that's how you continue to innovate, stay ahead of the competition. But with respect to validation or invalidation, you know, at some point you do have to make a call. Like, okay, have I collected enough data that I'm comfortable moving forward? And I think in that case, it's one of these pattern recognition exercises. So it could be that you speak to a handful of people and you get a really strong signal repeatedly, and that might be enough for you. It could be that you talk to a number of people and you get a bifurcated response, right? Some people saying no, some people saying yes. If you can identify the commonalities among the people who are responding one way or another, right? And feel like, well, I refine my questions. If I target this type of person, I do end up getting that same pattern, right? That might be enough, but it really is one big pattern recognition exercise. And I think the advantage of doing a program, having a mentor, instructors, whatever it might be, is that it helps to prevent some of the confirmation bias, right? So we all want to see our innovation as a must-have, but you have to really struggle against that. And having mentors or instructors who can serve that role of a reality check is really critical.
Confirmation bias point is huge. A lot of entrepreneurs sometimes go out and just listen for what they want to hear to confirm that your baby is cute or that your product is great. So it does take a bit of skill to ask the right questions and test the right hypotheses. So do you have any recommendations of resources or tools that anyone using this methodology should refer to?
Well, I think the first thing is you have to make sure you're talking to the right people. So one of the failure modes I see is that with entrepreneurs, they will go and talk to subject matter experts because those people are available and like to talk, and they will use them to confirm, core hypotheses for their businesses. So you do not want to do that. So you want to make sure you're talking to actual users, actual decision makers, actual influencers, actual payers, right? The people who are involved in decision making for your innovation. Now, you can talk to subject matter experts. It's helpful, particularly if you don't know an industry, because they can, one, provide introductions to people that you don't know, right? Get you into these critical networks of actual customers. And two, they can provide hypotheses, right? Again, they have an understanding of the industry that you might not have, and that understanding can be valuable. The distinction is what they tell you is a hypothesis. You have to go out and validate it with an actual customer. So I think that's the first thing, right? Make sure you're talking to the right person. Second thing is make sure that your discovery is guided by hypotheses and clear learning goals. So you don't want to go and just have open-ended discussions with people. Uh, Doing that, you will get information. If you go in with a hypothesis learning goal, you will get validation, right? Validation or invalidation, and both are equally valuable, right? But you have to know what it is you're trying to learn in each interview, right? And that guides your questions. That's really the North Star for your interview. So it's really critical to have those things. So I think you got to make sure you're talking to the right people, and you got to make sure that you're testing something and that something is relevant, right? So that will be the third point. So after you develop the hypotheses, do a sanity check on them, right? Is this the answer to this obvious? Is it answering some of the fundamental questions that I need to answer at the stage that I'm at? And again, if you're just starting out, you're at problem, solution, fit. So you got to validate the problem, right? Do they have the problem that you think they have? And you have to ask yourself, okay, is my hypothesis or my questions getting me to that answer?
Yeah, figuring out problem solution fit is the first step, and that's making the bones of what will be the value proposition. And the value proposition is really what's at the center of the business model canvas, which is a great tool to use to organize hypotheses. So I heard you say, talk to the right people, make sure your conversations are guided by hypotheses, which I recommend are organized by the business model canvas boxes. And then three is make sure you do a sanity check. And I think participating in programs or incubators can be a great way to get the access to resources or peers who are understanding the same types of things that you're going through. So maybe we can talk a little bit about the business model canvas at this point.
Sure.
Yeah, tell me about the tool and how it can help in this lean startup and customer discovery process.
Yeah, so the business model canvas is your lab notebook, right, for the scientific method that you're going to use for entrepreneurship. So it's a good way to begin to capture, as you noted, your core hypotheses around your business. So, some ways that you might hear the business model canvas referred to is the planning before the business plan. It's really easy to think the first step for me is to develop a business plan, but then you would fill all of that with things that are guesses, but state them as fact, right? And that's really the challenge around starting with a business plan. So what you want to do is use the business model canvas again as your lab notebook to test your hypotheses. The idea is that it captures all of the content that will go into a business plan, but it's just much more accessible, right? It becomes very easy to change things because the tools that you use, Launchpad Central, Innovation Within, Strategize, or whatever, you use will present all of these hypotheses as sticky notes, right? Things that you can take on, put off, change very rapidly, which is not true for a business plan. And what we do in the programs that we run is walk through it sequentially, right? Figure out, well, who are your customers? Can we get some clear thought on that? What are the associated value propositions that they care about? When we can get that together, now we can move on to other boxes, right? Well, how would you get the product to them? What are your guesses? How do we go out and test that, right? How do you get, keep, and grow customers? How do you market to them? Go out and test that. What would your revenue model begin to look like, right? Go out and test that. And that would give us, some vision of the internal operation of your company. Then on the left-hand side, we begin to look at, well, operationally, what do you need? Are there partners that you need based on the key activities and resources that are required? And given those things, the partner, the resource, the activities, what are your cost centers in the business, right? Now we can begin to get an assessment. Is this something that you should do? So again, I think it's a beautiful tool for allowing you to explore all avenues that would go into your business plan, but doing it quickly.
One thing you're alluding to is that customer discovery never stops, or stakeholder discovery. You have to do it to get the value prop and the customer segments identified initially to make sure you have the right problem solution fit. But then in terms of what you said about getting, keeping, and growing customers, you do need to talk to distributors and other people that will facilitate the relationship, and then who you're going to be partnering with or working with, both internally and externally, to make this a reality in terms of delivering that value. All of that requires this methodology and this mindset of customer discovery and making sure that your hypotheses across all of the elements of a business model are correct. Yeah. So customer discovery never stops.
Yeah, I agree. And one thing I would add is that in my own experience, I shared this with Steve one of the first times I spoke to him, that I think most entrepreneurs have a sense that, yes, I need to develop something that people care about, right? If I'm going to do sales, I will go in and try to understand what the need is, who's involved in the purchasing process. Like, you might wander into customer discovery that way. But what people don't often do, and I know in our own company, we did not do early, was really test some of these other assumptions, right? Am I using the right channel? Am I constantly evaluating my get, keep, grow strategy and what really makes the most sense given the limited budget that I have as a startup, right? Which partners make the most sense, right? Not the ones that just happen to be sexiest, but where is the match that I continue to be a priority for them? And by doing those things, you'll save yourself a lot of time and a lot of money.
Another thing I heard you say was about the lab notebook and this being a scientific method. And I think that really helps, especially scientific founders get comfortable with starting a business. So I really like that language helps scientific founders become more entrepreneurial and more comfortable with starting a business. So
you have some of the tools at their disposal and have been exposed to them already. So
right. So who is the right, person or type of entrepreneur to be using the lean startup methodology?
Who is not the right type of entrepreneur to use the lean startup methodology? It's one of those interesting things, when we deploy the programs on campus, I mean, nominally, they are positioned as entrepreneurship programs, But really, we think of this as a 21st century tool set, right? So what we think employers want in graduates. So it's always this entrepreneur, so someone who is innovating to create a new company versus entrepreneur, right? Someone who is innovating within a company. And the tool set overlaps, right? So it's called lean startup, but that doesn't mean you're starting a company. Maybe you're starting a new product or project within an entity, and you would use the same approach. So I really think it is applicable to everyone. And, you know, like I said, we engage with students and faculty on campus, but we also engage with companies in the broader DC ecosystem. So I have ongoing engagement with the International Monetary Fund. They have an innovation group. And this kind of training is part of their leadership development. So their emerging leaders go through programs that emphasize design thinking, lean startup, et cetera, because that's the way that they want to be able to be nimble and deploy new product that are meaningful for, you know, kind of their stakeholders. So yeah, so again, I think it's who does this not apply to?
Bit of a trick question. That's what I was hoping you would say. I think it's a great skill set for anyone to have, is to be able to understand a real problem and see where there's a way to solve that problem using a technology innovation or some other solution,
Yeah.
and then to grow a business around it that can be scalable and repeatable. So any tips, final tips that you want to share with any entrepreneurs embarking on doing customer discovery and building their startup?
Yeah, I guess the last thing that I would talk about is, you know, kind of this idea of the MVP, because this is another one of the traps that entrepreneur can fall into. You know, oftentimes we think about our innovation as a fait accompli, right? So I love it, everybody's going to love it. And I'm locked now into that solution, even though that solution might look like a Swiss Army knife, right? It has kind of every single thing I could possibly imagine attached to it, but that makes it very difficult for it to be deployed in some ways. So this idea of MVP is really at the core of the process, right? How do I maximize my learning with the minimum amount of time, cost, effort? And so when you think about how you deploy a solution, right? So we talked about going out and doing the problem interviews to validate that there's a problem. You have to go out and also do these solution interviews. And you can include an MVP in that if you think clearly about what an MVP is. So Google has a good TED talk where they walk through how they tested the Google Glass concept without building the Google Glass, right? So if you're really clear about what it is you want to test, you don't have to build the full solution, even if you think it's going to be a high technology solution. So in the programs we run, you know, when we think about an MVP, and again, this kind of maximum learning, minimum effort, it might be a mock-up, right? Approximation of the physical product. You might accompany that mock-up with some storyboarding. When we think about, you know, big companies like Dropbox started with an explainer video, right? Didn't do any coding, had an explainer video about how this worked, saw how people responded to it, then began to develop and deploy the product. So again, you can do something like that very quickly. So again, be thoughtful about what it is you need to present to the customer to test the solution side before you begin to build. And I think that's really, really important.
Startups are cash constrained. You don't want to see a startup spending all of their money and getting this product, you know, perfectly designed in the right color with the right buttons before they've actually validated that it's what the customer wants to pay for. So this is really saving potentially years of work, even if it's not perfect yet, right? Even if it's not available in all the colors or does all the features that you need it to do yet, having that basic a way to solve that customer problem, and then making it nicer and fancier as you validated it, is a really great benefit of this process.
Yeah, indeed. Don't let perfect get in the way of the perfectly good. So
Yeah, I love that saying. That's great. A couple of resources just to mention as well. So we talked about the business model canvas that's available on strategizer.com. Alexander Osterwalder is the architect of the business model canvas, and Steve Blank and his lean startup methodology go hand in hand. And I also want to plug the short, free, downloadable book called Talking to Humans. It's really helpful in doing customer interviews and making sure that you're not planting the confirmation bias in the way of your questions. One of my favorite comics in that book is, well, everyone will love it. Have you actually talked to anyone outside of this room? And if you talk to your parents, they're obviously going to say that everything is nice and good job and it's great. So you got to talk to the people who care. Well, I think that's a good place for us to stop for today. I want to thank you very much, Grant, for sharing your experience and your insights. Your students are really lucky to have you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
For our listeners, we encourage you to check out our other Just Innovation talks by visiting our website, justnetwork.org.